What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Katson's Corner, the show where we talk about college football, how it relates to the Chargers, how it relates to the draft, and everything in between. We are back for another episode this week. We're going to preview the college football playoff games coming up on January 1st, with the national championship coming up on January 8th. Obviously, still a couple weeks out, but we're not going to have another episode until those games happen. So, figured we might as well do it this week to give you guys some perhaps rooting interests for prospects to watch for the Chargers and everything as you watch those games on your holiday vacations. Before we do that, make sure you guys do all the YouTube stuff, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to the Chargers channel so you get those episodes with Steven and Tyler. Hit the notification bell both places so you get notified every time we are doing something, because we're doing a lot of stuff all the time and sometimes you miss them. Um, if you want to follow my work specifically, you can find me on Twitter at Alex Katson, the same way you see it spelled on the screen. That's normally the best place to find all of my stuff because I'm in a lot of places wearing a lot of different hats this time of year. As the draft stuff starts to pick up, I also pick up more and more responsibilities, more and more stuff on my plate. Still covering the Chargers, doing all my college football stuff, but then also expanding into the draft stuff, which is mostly on Chargers Wire, but some other places. And so, really, just going over to my Twitter account and finding out what I've been doing recently is the best way to do that. And then, before we get started with the actual preview of the playoff and everything, I did want to touch on briefly what the staff changes that the Chargers have made are going to, how those are going to affect the way that the Chargers approach the draft this season. Because I know a lot of you are probably curious about that. Obviously, it's a big change with Brandon Staley and Tom Telesco both being out. So you're changing over the entire front office. You're changing over, well, as we'll talk about in a second, not changing over the entire front office, but changing over a large portion of the front office and changing over a large portion, if not all, of the coaching staff. And so it does logically follow that the approach to the draft would be significantly different. And that's true, but it's also not true. Because what will happen this next few months is, as the Chargers look for a new general manager, they will do interviews and everything and pick that guy when the time comes. And, John Spanos' comments today made it seem like that decision might not come necessarily before they make a decision at head coach. They might do kind of a tandem hiring like some other teams have done the last couple of years to kind of like get those guys in sync. They might hire a head coach first and then hire a GM, which is a little bit backwards from the way that teams normally do it. They might do any number of things. There's still a lot of variables left to be decided. But when that GM gets hired, whoever it is, they are not going to make over the entire scouting staff. They're not going to make over the entire like upper structure of the front office. And the reason for that is because they're going to get hired probably in January, right? And so you have 3 months until the draft at that point. Um, Scouting is a very inelastic industry, especially in the NFL. There are not very many of those people. There are also not very many assistants or whoever that you can just kind of like call up and give a promotion to get them to move over to a new team on short notice, like you can in the coaching ranks. There's not an entire pipeline of college coaches that have very transferable responsibilities that you can just hire into the NFL to be like, hey, you're going to do this now. That's not really the way that it works. Scouting is it's a very small industry and it's a very inelastic industry. For the most part, you are you are one of 15 or 16 people in a front office, and that includes like directors of player personnel, scouting assistants, like everything from top to bottom. So it's a very small tree of people, and those people are not going to turn over on such short notice before the draft. That's just not the way that it works. That's not the way the industry works. So the Chargers are going to keep most of that, most if not all of that scouting staff that is already in place. Um, the reason for that is because all of those people have already done all of this legwork on the draft that's in 3 months. Versus if you hire a bunch of guys out of college, you hire a bunch of guys that haven't been like in an NFL front office this entire season, or even if you hire guys from another team, which is virtually impossible. If you hire those guys on short notice and then you say like, "Here's my vision, here's what I want for the draft," and those guys have done no prep, then 3 months is not enough time to prep for the draft. I can tell you that myself because I try to do draft prep on 3 months notice all the time, and it's not enough time to learn the entire width and breadth of the draft. That's just not, again, just not how it works. And so the Chargers are going to keep most of that front office structure intact, at least through the draft. They'll go through the draft, and what'll happen essentially is the new general manager will get in a meeting room and they'll say like, "Hey, here's the new directive for uh, what we're doing this year. You guys have already watched all the players. You've determined who might have been a good fit for the previous regime, for the previous scheme, for the previous this, that, whatever. Here's what we're looking for with the new thing." And all of those scouts who've already watched hundreds of players at this point will say, "Oh, well, I wrote a profile on this guy, and at the time, he wasn't really like a fit for what we were looking for. But now maybe we should bring him back up." And they'll kind of reshape the board that way. And it'll be kind of a more on the fly process. This is another reason why um, you see a lot of first year GMs maybe not necessarily have a fantastic draft because you're piecing a lot of it together very short notice. So I do want to kind of temper expectations there of like the draft this season may not turn out to be like the best draft of all time or anything like that. Um, then they'll go through the draft, they'll finish that, and then you get to May. And May, June, July are where front offices in the NFL make all of their moving transactions. The best way to think about this is that coaching transactions and everything, coaching moves and stuff like that normally happen once the season ends, right? You get to January, the season is over, you fire coaches, coaches leave, coaches get new opportunities, they do all this stuff, but the season has already ended. Same thing with players and free agency, right? The season is ended. And so you get to March and you go, okay, the window is open, you can move teams now. Until the draft ends in April, scouts and the front office are still in the middle of the season, right? And so their season doesn't end until May. And so then when that season ends, then it's okay, now is the time where it makes more sense to do all this shuffling around and everything. And so even if that new GM gets hired in January or whatever it's going to be, because they're going to pick someone to lead them into the draft and do all this extra stuff, but it's going to be with the staff they currently have. And then when we get to May, then you'll see a lot more of their like kind of top lieutenant hires. They'll hire a director of player personnel. They'll hire a director of college scouting, a director of pro scouting. Kind of like things in that kind of similar vein, and that'll happen over the summer. And then the mid and lower level scouting jobs will probably be the same people as they are right now. Because again, there's not a whole lot of people to draw from. You might hire one or two new scouting assistants that are fresh out of college or that are moving from the college to the pro ranks or something like that, and like move on from some guys because they're not fits for this, that, whatever. But the majority of them are going to stay the same. Scouting staffs, by and large, are basically independent of the front office, of the coaching staff, of everything else. They kind of operate on their own thing. The best way to illustrate this is to go and look at basically anyone that's a GM candidate for the Chargers job. Every single one of them has spent a decade plus with the same team. Uh, Not all of those teams have had the same general manager or the same coach or the same anything over that last decade plus. But that one guy who's the assistant GM now or the director of player personnel or whatever now has been there most of the time. And like once you get up to those higher ranks, then sometimes it's like, okay, well, he was he was a scout with the Ravens for 12, 15 years or something. And then he got hired to be director of player personnel with the Eagles. And now he's the assistant GM for the Bears or whatever. Right. Um, and so once you started to get up in those lower levels, there's a lot more jumping around that happens. But at the lower levels and at the mid-tier levels, even like at your like national scouts and everything like that, right? There's not going to be a whole lot of turnover. And so don't expect there to be a lot of turnover. I like don't expect there to be like a complete overhaul of the scouting staff because they've underperformed with this regime and everything. And so they are going to bring in a fresh new set of guys, a completely overhaul. Not how it works. So don't get mad when that doesn't happen, because it's not going to happen. Um, and so now that I've done ranting about that and done ranting about the structure of NFL front offices and how, nothing that the Chargers have done this season is going to change, except for the fact that a new general manager is going to come in and they're going to say, hey, this is the new direction. But every other episode that we've done up to this point, still valid. The Chargers have still been to 6 Penn State games. They've still been to 4 Ohio State games. The scouts are still going to be the most familiar with those players coming into this draft because those scouts are still going to be the same people. Um, and so everything that we've said about those players and everything that we've said about their interest in those players is still valid. And you can go back and you can watch those episodes and you can get familiar with those people. Part of this rant is me advertising the other episodes of the show, right? Because it's like those still matter. You can still go back and watch those, and the information is still the same. Um, and then obviously, like with the coaching staff and everything, like people are going to have different things that they covet, and people are going to have different things that they want and everything. And so it's just going to be an adjustment. It's like if at your job they hired a new CEO and they said, hey, this is the new direction the company is going in. You're not getting fired, but the company is shifting in a different direction. Think of it like that. Okay, now let's talk about the playoff. We're going to start from the number 4 seed and work our way up. So we'll start with number 4, Alabama here. We're going to do one player on offense, one player on defense for each 4 of these teams that I think is either most worthy of talking about for the Chargers or worthy to talk about the Chargers and is someone that we haven't got to focus on a lot for the show. So for Alabama, we're going to talk about offensive tackle JC Latham and corner Terrion Arnold. Latham has been a popular pick for the Chargers in round 1 before the pick kind of started to matriculate further and further up the board. But when they were kind of in that like 10 to 15 range, he was a pretty popular pick for them. He is the top natural right tackle in the draft, which is why he's been a popular pick for the Chargers. There's been a lot of discussion in recent days and weeks and everything as the Chargers pick has gotten higher up the board about an Olu Fashanu or a Joe Alt or something like that. Personally, I'm not the biggest fan of that, simply because those guys play left tackle, and moving them to right tackle is a pain. And a lot of times it doesn't work. There are some times where it does work. The Lions obviously did it with Penei Sewell when they get drafted him out of Oregon, but you can also point to an example like the Giants drafting Evan Neal a couple of years ago out of Alabama, who had played right tackle in college before even, but spent his final college season as a left tackle. They move him back to right tackle, and it's been a disaster. Um, a lot of times those moves come down to whether or not the coaching staff has been able to develop offensive linemen. And with the way that the staff currently is with the Chargers, obviously we don't know what it's going to look like by the time the draft rolls around, but with the way that it currently is, that's something that the Chargers have struggled with. And so I personally, as of right now, and this is subject to change depending on who the hires are and everything, but as of right now, I would prefer to take someone that already has experience at right tackle, has played right tackle more recently, rather than take one of these maybe more blue quote unquote blue chip talents and move them over to the right side, because a lot of times that can be more trouble than it's worth. Latham is the top natural right tackle in the class, and so the fit with the Chargers is pretty natural. At this point, he's more of a trade down candidate than a pick him at where the pick is going to be candidate, which I think would outrage a fair number of people if Fashanu or Alt was on the board and they traded down and then took a different tackle. Obviously, that's not probably not going to be people's favorite thing in the world. I think it makes more sense, but obviously, I am not employed by an NFL front office. You could argue that that's for a reason. um, and so, what do I know? Maybe it happens, right? But Latham's going to have a really interesting matchup against the Michigan D line that just kind of underperformed a little bit this season, but has been kind of up and down, and still has players that are going to be able to get after Jalen Milroe in that game. So it's going to be interesting to see how he plays out there. On the defensive side, Terrion Arnold is kind of the quote unquote other Alabama quarterback. Obviously, Kool-Aid McKinstry is someone, again, who's been talked about with the Chargers' first round pick. I thought about talking about him here, but I didn't want to talk about 2 different trade down candidates in the same section. And so I think Kool-Aid is kind of in that same tier as Latham, where it's kind of like you want to trade down a few picks maybe and pick them up more around like the 12 to 18 range. Is kind of more where I see him as of right now. Arnold has arguably been better than McKinstry this season anyway, and he is still kind of climbing boards. He hasn't really like gotten into like the bona fide first round conversation yet. That doesn't mean that he won't, but it does mean that as of right now, it might be a little bit easier to find him at say the top of the second round where the Chargers will be picking, rather than taking him at the top of the first round, like you'd have to do with McKinstry. Um, I do think that like we've talked about on the show before with the hole at corner, it is something that's going to need to be addressed early in the draft. You could also say that for 4 other positions probably for the Chargers. But you look at the top of the draft and it's so offense heavy that like getting a corner at the top of the second is probably going to be a more viable path for them. Assuming that they don't trade down, which now that a different GM will be in place, all bets are off. But assuming that there's no trades or anything, just for the sake of simplicity, Arnold is someone who could be available at the top of the second and is going to have a probably a big impact on this game, because Michigan's wide receivers aren't like super standout or anything, and JJ McCarthy is going to have to be pretty on his game in order to move the ball against this Alabama secondary, and Arnold's going to be a big reason for that. Moving on to number 3, Texas. We're going to talk about wide receiver AD Mitchell and corner Jahdae Barron. We've actually not talked about Mitchell on the show before, which kind of surprised me going through my notes of previous ones and stuff. I had figured that we surely had touched on him. He's another guy that I think is going to be available around the top of the second, might sneak into the back half of the first. He's one of those guys that is pretty firmly in that wide receiver 5 conversation with like Brian Thomas and Troy Franklin and a couple other guys like that. He's much more advanced route runner. And so if that's sort of your thing, then you're going to like him a ton. I know a wide receiver evaluator that I really respect, who's a high school wide receiver coach, out in the Bay Area, who's on Twitter and will post his opinion about prospects every now and then. He's really high on Mitchell. And so he's someone that I still need to circle back to and study a little bit more in depth, but he's been gaining more and more steam, kind of as the process has gone on, kind of like still in that like late first, early second range. Another player to kind of keep an eye on stock wise. If he slips a little bit of like, oh, top of the second, here we go, wide receiver, because the Chargers didn't take a wide receiver or a tight end or an offensive weapon of some sort in the first round for whatever reason that may be. Barron on the other side is someone that I'm going to be watching pretty closely because I haven't gotten a ton of looks at him this season so far. But he does have a Senior Bowl invite already, which generally means that you have feedback draft wise that you will be picked in the first 5 rounds. That doesn't mean that you will be drafted in the first 5 rounds. There are players with 4th and 5th round feedback that go undrafted every season. But it does mean that someone, at least one team out there, thinks that you are a talent worthy of going in the top 5 rounds. And he is going to have probably the toughest matchup of anyone in this entire slideshow, because Texas, of course, is playing my beloved Washington Huskies, who have 3 NFL caliber wide receivers who are all going to be fully healthy for the first time in a long time. And so even if the receivers move around and the formations change and everything, there's not an easy matchup for Barron this entire game, nor is there an easy matchup for anyone in the Texas secondary this entire game. Which means that he could either have a huge game where all of a sudden everyone is talking about him because he locks down Roma Dunze or something, or he could have a very, very quiet game where he's on the wrong end of a lot of highlight plays. And if it is the former and not the latter, then he's someone that is going to be talked about a lot more and going to have a lot of hype and a lot of momentum heading into the Senior Bowl week. And then if he, continues with a good Senior Bowl week, then it's like, oh my God, why haven't we been talking about this guy as like a top 50 pick this whole season? And so that's something to just kind of watch to see if that train starts to leave the station a little bit, or if he kind of has a quiet night on a big stage. Moving on to number 2, again, my beloved Washington Huskies. I'm a UW alum, for those of you that don't know. And so I will be rooting for them in this game. They have a litany of prospects that we could talk about. We touched on the receivers a little bit. We've talked about them on the show before. We could talk about Dylan Johnson, the running back. We could talk about, any number of players really on that team. There's two NFL caliber edge rushers, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to talk about Troy Fautanu, who's the left tackle for UW, but will probably move into guard in the NFL. He's really just someone that I wanted to get on the show and talk about because I haven't touched on him this season because it's kind of an awkward fit for the Chargers. Left tackle obviously is set with Rashawn Slater. Left guard is maybe a little bit less set than it seemed like it was going into the year. With Zion Johnson struggling a little bit, although he has picked up kind of in recent weeks, been a little bit more up and down. Um, but Fatanu is someone who could slide into guard. Could probably flip him over to the right side if he really needed to. He has played on the right side a little bit, I think, if I remember right, at Washington. And so if you want to flip him to right guard because you're changing positions for him anyway, then that's something that you could consider. If you want to move him to left guard because you're a fan of moving Zion Johnson to center, say, then you could do that too. And just kind of try to find your best five there. He's going to have a big day against Texas's defensive line. Texas is mostly a interior focused team D-line wise, but they do have a couple edge rushers who could cause a little bit of damage. Washington's offensive line has been very good this season, and so I wouldn't expect a ton of pressure on Michael Penix. So don't overreact if you haven't seen Washington play this season. Don't overreact to oh my God, he didn't get touched the whole game. Fatanu must be a top 15 pick. No, that's just kind of the way that the offense operates. He's going to be a top 40 pick, I think. And so again, someone that we're talking about is a top of the second round if he's on the board. And it's just this is the best player and all that stuff. The guy on the defense I want to talk about is corner Jabbar Muhammad, who's kind of had a more up and down season than some people would have you believe. There were a couple conference games in there that weren't on national TV and everything, where there's a little bit of a lull in his performance and stuff. But every time that the Huskies have been in prime time, every time they've been on national TV, every time they've been on a big stage, Muhammad has a big game. He's one of those guys that just gets up for the big moments. There is no bigger moment than the college football playoff. And so I'm kind of expecting him to play very well. He is a fifth-year senior, has played all 5 years. He started his first 4 seasons at Oklahoma State. I believe was named All Big 12 a couple of times. And so it's not like he's, having a breakout season by any means or anything. But, you know, performing on big stages and everything like that is something that NFL evaluators take into account because playing on an NFL stage every Sunday is a big stage no matter what television network you're on. There's no Pac-12 network in the NFL, for example. And so evaluators do look at that sort of thing. So if he has another big game against Texas's wide receivers, we touched on Mitchell, and they also have Xavier Worthy and, 3 other guys that they can throw the ball to. And so if he can kind of hang with them the same way that he's hung with Oregon's wide receiver core, the 2 times that Washington has played them, I think that he's another guy that we could be talking about as a riser coming out of the playoff season. And finishing it off here with number 1 seed Michigan, who has Alabama in the Rose Bowl on January 1st. We'll talk about running back Blake Corum first. Surprisingly, I have not talked about him a ton on this show. He does lead college football in touchdowns, but he's kind of turned into Jamal Williams this season, where Jamal Williams was very in the touchdown lead hunt in the NFL last season before Austin Eckler ended up taking it. But Williams was just getting 1 and 2 and 3 yard touchdowns over and over and over again. It wasn't really a ton of long runs or anything. That's kind of what Corum has been doing this season as well. They'll get down inside the 5 and then hand it off to him, and he just kind of plows forward and gets the touchdown and counts on the stat sheet all the same. He has looked slower this season. There are a number of potential reasons why that could be. He did, I think, tear his ACL last year. If he didn't tear his ACL, he did have a knee injury of some sort last season, but I believe it was a torn ACL. And so the first year that you come back from those, you see that with a lot of players, where the first year that you come back from the ACL, you don't look the same. And then the second year that you come back, now you're back to normal because you trust the stability in the knee again. You kind of have played a full year on it, and you're okay, it's not going to tear again if I try to do anything. And so a lot of guys will kind of get a bump that second year. But the other concern with Corum is that he has a ton of carries on him. His mileage is high. You are buying a used car. You are not buying a new car like you should be in the draft, generally speaking. And so that is going to kind of drive his value down a little bit, I think. And then, especially with the way that he's kind of underperformed this season, it kind of makes for a murky draft projection. But knowing that he is going to possibly get this year two bump off the ACL tear. Maybe it's someone that you buy low on a little bit if he starts to slip. The running back class is very crowded. It's going to be very interesting to see how it plays out. I have a lot of guys that I have all kind of grouped in like a third, fourth, fifth round range. And so if you start to kind of get in the middle to late part of that, and a lot of the guys that you like are gone, but Corum is still there, then maybe it's someone that you kind of buy the dip on, for lack of a better term, and see if you can get something out of him for a couple of years. Because at that point, it's a day three pick. He's cheap. You can move on from him when his rookie contract ends and he's out of miles. Um, all the stuff that comes with being a running back in the NFL. And then the other guy that I want to talk about, and we'll close out the show with this, is slot corner Mike Sainristil. This is a guy who started out as a wide receiver at Michigan, moved over to the defensive side of the ball, I think prior to last season, prior to the 2021 season, and moved to slot corner just kind of cuz, and has really excelled there after being kind of a like role player at receiver. Um, the main thing with him is that he is tiny. He's kind of reminiscent of like a Clark Phillips from Utah last year, where he's very small, but he plays a lot bigger and he's around the ball all the time and he's making plays all the time. Um, and so similar to Phillips, if you just look at production and you just look at, you know, highlight tapes and you look at everything like that, you're like, wow, this guy's a first round player. Why are we not talking about him more? And then you look at the measurables and you look at kind of like the history of those guys in the NFL, and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, probably like third or fourth round. Um, if you want to talk about changing the culture of the team and doing all that sort of stuff and addressing a need at slot corner potentially, Sanders still is someone that you should really, really look into because he is a tone setter, and there's really no better way that I can describe him. Just go watch him play. I'm sure he'll have a couple of splash plays in that game against Alabama with as much kind of shallow stuff as they run on offense. And so I am interested to see how he holds up against kind of a traditionally thought of as being much bigger team. Obviously, Alabama, the SEC team, kind of thought of as this giant juggernaut of mega athletes that are all chiseled out of marble and everything. And so, if he has a tough game where he slides off a few of those tackles and everything, and maybe like Milrow bounces off of him a couple times on some scrambles and stuff, then it's like, I am worried. But if he has a nice game, then this is someone again, kind of the same with all these corners, where it's just like if he has a nice game, then it's like we're going to be talking about him a lot more. And I think that he's someone that we should be talking about a lot more anyway, because he's awesome. I love him, honestly. And so I'm really excited to see him play in that playoff game as well. That's going to do it for this week, guys. Hope you found all of that informative. Hope you have established some players to watch for the playoff. Give yourself a little bit of rooting interest if you didn't have any already coming into the weekend. I, of course, am going to be rooting for Washington to win the whole thing. Hope that kind of bit at the beginning about the front office was helpful for you guys to kind of like get an idea of how that stuff is going to look. I know that stuff can be confusing and weird, and so just wanted to kind of lay that down for you guys a little bit so that we all kind of know what to expect going forward here as everything sort of turns over and changes and does all that stuff. We will be off next week for the holiday. I hope you guys have a nice holiday. I will be traveling back home to see my parents, so I won't have my setup and everything. So we'll be off next week. We'll see about coming back the week after. Obviously, that'll be right around New Year's, and so might take that week off as well. But we will be back eventually. We'll probably start getting into more like deep dive preview sort of stuff, or deep dive like individual prospect sort of stuff rather. So be on the lookout for that. But until then, I will catch you guys next time. Bolt up.